welcome to the Full Scottish. I'm Ruth Watson. My guests today are Councillor Katy Loudon, SNP candidate for Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and Hugh Marshall of Talking Wales. Hey guys, thanks very much for joining us today. We have a packed programme for you, and we'll be coming to Katy and Hugh just in a few moments. But first, we have today's update from Ukraine. The Ukraine update on day 529 of the Russian war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has attacked a blood transfusion centre in the country as he condemned the fatal strike as a war crime. A separate attack struck a key factory. Russian forces struck the blood transfusion centre in the Kharkiv region of northeast Ukraine, Zelensky said, adding that dead and wounded are reported. A guided air bomb hit the centre in Kupiansk, a city a few dozen kilometres from the Russian border, he said. Ukraine carried out a drone strike on a Russian tanker in the Kerch Strait, a day after one of Moscow's warships was hit in the Black Sea. A video released by Ukrainian authorities appeared to show an unmanned sea drone striking the side of the 141-metre Russian-flagged SIG under the darkness of night. The strike was the second such naval attack in a 24-hour period, after the scuppering of a Russian landing ship on Friday outside the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Russia says it has captured the settlement of Novoselivsk in northeast Ukraine, where Kyiv has reported increased attacks. Footage from the Russian army showed Novoselivsk completely destroyed, with white smoke billowing over crumbling buildings. Ukrainian army spokesman Gana Malyar said Russian troops were aiming to draw Ukrainian resources to the east as Ukraine pursues its counteroffensive in the south. There were reports of explosions in several cities, including Kyiv and Zaporizhzhia, with air alerts. Ukraine said Russia fired ballistic and Kinzhal missiles into the city, with some reports indicating Russian forces were firing missiles from inside Belarusian territory. Zelensky's spokesperson, Yulia Mendel, tweeted, "Right now, the missile attack is at Kyiv, Vinnytsia, Zhytomyr, Cherkasy regions, but the alert is all over Ukraine." President Zelensky has promised a fresh round of institutional cleaning, a reference to his campaign to show Western partners that Kyiv has moved on from a history of deep-rooted corruption. Next week will be a continuation of our work on cleaning state institutions of those who try to drag from the past all those old habits, old schemes that weakened Ukraine for a very long time, for decades, he said. Talks have started in Saudi Arabia to find a peaceful settlement to Russia's war in Ukraine. It is hoped this weekend's meeting of national security advisors and other senior officials from about 40 countries, but not Russia, will reach agreements on principles of how to end the conflict. Andriy Yermak, the head of the Ukrainian president's office and his main envoy for the talks in Jeddah, said, "I expect that the conversation will be difficult, but behind us is truth. Behind us is goodness." Well, now turning to my guests in their various locations dotted around Scotland and Wales, we have Katy and Hugh. Thanks again for joining us, guys. So it's a packed programme. There's lots to be getting through. Let's dive straight into North Sea oil. So for a UK government that claims to be, sort of taking the climate emergency seriously, and given that Scotland was told in 2014 that our oil was running out and therefore our economy would be worthless, at the start of the week, Rishi Sunak came to Scotland to announce over 100 new oil and gas licences to max out the production of oil and gas to support the UK economy and energy market. Meanwhile, UK government funding of green energy production and building installation is inadequate and very unlikely to meet their net zero target. I mean, what can one make of this? Katy, it's beyond bizarre in some respects. It's getting some huge degree of criticism globally. What's your view on the matter?
Yes, and the point that you made at the beginning there, here we go again, Sunak's in Scotland because he wants something from us and not because he's offering us anything. Stephen Flynn was talking the other day about the £1 billion of funding which had been announced for carbon capture and storage by Ed Davey pre-independence referendum, which mysteriously disappeared. And the SNP have been campaigning for this since 2005. The announcement specifically about the licences, I mean, it's driving a wrecking ball through the climate commitments that the UK government have or are supposed to hold. Even his own MPs are now warning that he's going to be on the wrong side of history with this. I thought Ed Miliband had a really good point this week about Sunak lurching towards this culture war on climate as a tactic to deflect and divide all of this nonsense about him being the champion of the motor car. And we know where this is coming from. It's coming on the basis of polling, which is showing that some of his environmental policies are deeply unpopular with Tory voters. And I think that's the most frustrating thing about this. It's about the lens through which these decisions have been looked at. Of course, it's right to be conscious about energy security. And of course, it's important that we're conscious of the need for a just transition to protect our highly skilled workforce here in Scotland. Those are the two lenses which any decisions on future licensing should have been looked at, and not through the lens of how to shore up Tory voters.
But I mean, Hugh, the economic illiteracy of this is fairly mind blowing. I mean, there's been a number of analysts come on to point out that it actually doesn't really support the UK economy and energy market because the gas and oil, because it's not a nationalised company, is being sold on the global market, and so when it comes back into Scotland or the UK, it's coming at international market prices. So, I mean, what's the take in Wales on this? Does anybody have an answer other than political opportunism?
I think, as you say, the people who are going to benefit from this are the shareholders of the oil and gas companies. It was interesting how the framing, I think it was BP this week, had quarter profits of £2 billion, and it was reported as a collapse of 70%. It wasn't a collapse because the last year's numbers were inflated because of the war in Ukraine, and obviously with the price of oil and gas becoming slightly more stable, that's had the impact. But at the end of the day, it's all about extraction, not just of oil and gas, but of wealth. These companies that have supported not just Conservatives, but just globally, the right-wing capitalistic sort of governments, they're looking to get as much money in as they can, before we swap over to renewables. So, it might be a little bit cynical, but that's the reality of it. We should be accelerating, sort of renewables. And it's interesting as well is the lack of planning. Coal disappeared, as an industry in Wales in the 80s. There was no plan for what to come after that. So we've known about oil and gas and we've known about renewables, but we're still behind it. And it was interesting to see Sunak coming up to Scotland to talk about oil and gas. Cynically, you had Starmer up there as well talking about, sort of renewables, because, Wales and Scotland are both things that they're rich in. It are those resources, wind, water, and, it is that extractive attitude that, being part of the United Kingdom benefits us.
So, Katy, I mean, you're going around the doors at the moment, sort of the doors of Rutherglen and Hamilton West, as you've sort of put your hat in the ring to see if you can become the next MP. Obviously, there's other candidates. You've got the Labour and Lib Dems and the Tories are out there too. What sort of feedback are you getting on the doors when you're talking to people? Is this a live issue? Is this something that you're aware that that the folk on the doors are interested in, that they care about? And what kind of spin are your opposing candidates trying to put on it?
Yes, it absolutely is an issue which people are very interested in talking about. Of course, it relates to, and I'm sure I'll be mentioning this few times this afternoon, the single biggest issue which we're hearing on the doorsteps is about the cost of living crisis and everything that entails, including rising energy bills as well. So anytime we're out speaking to people, they are very interested in talking to us about profits which large conglomerates, oil companies are making, and on policy in this as well. There's also a lot of interest in active travel in the area as well. Speaking to a constituent at length about that yesterday, and moving towards more climate-friendly ways of moving around. People are interested in speaking about insulation, heating their homes, how they're going to keep warm this winter. That's starting to come to the forefront of people's minds at the moment. So it very much is something which people are talking about. In terms of from other parties, again, I'm sure we'll speak about this later as well. They're in some ways they're saying very little. We do have, you were saying, we don't have a Lib Dem candidate yet. We have a Tory candidate who we've seen very little of. I think he's been spotted once speaking on camera in the city chambers in Glasgow. He hasn't actually been over to the constituency as far as I can see, but I'm sure he's going to have some difficult questions to answer because people are interested in speaking about the effects of the climate crisis and the effects of rising energy bills on their lives.
And I mean, in terms of green energy production, building insulation, I mean, I looked into getting my very old house to see what could be done to insulate that, make it greener, and the answer is not a huge amount without a fantastic amount of money, which I don't have. So I mean, if we're looking at lots of the new houses, for example, aren't having solar panels put on top, and I don't know why why not? That surely makes sense, and what are people going to do about getting older houses insulated for winter? I mean, what do you think the plans should be, Katy?
So there is a lot of work going on in this area just now. So I obviously see this kind of issue through council casework, and there's a great deal of funding for people through Warmer Home Scotland, for example, via the Scottish Government. Absolutely fabulous advice line, which I've been able to direct a lot of people to over the course of last winter and before, and I'm sure as the winter is approaching, we'll be doing the same as well, where people have the chance to speak through their options with advisors. They can talk about their building, the home which they are in, and look at solutions, whether that's insulation, external insulation, internal insulation. There's all sorts of things which can be done, and there is funding for that, which is out there. Do have to say, one of the hot topics in this area, that there is mistrust in the UK government, some UK government schemes. There's been an ongoing scandal for a number of years around the mis-selling of solar panels, and that was in particular to do with the feed-in tariff. This was UK government money, which was essentially mismanaged, leaving people with solar panels which were useless, and the benefits which they had been promised, they weren't then achieving. And unfortunately, the UK government have been very, very slow and then sorting that out for people, and making sure that they've been compensated correctly. So there is not a great deal of trust in what the UK government could offer to consumers, residents in this area.
But we just have 1 minute to go. I mean, on this topic, but I mean, do you think the Scottish Government would do any better?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yes, Katy. Yeah, no, sorry, just your attention as well. I mean, do you think that what evidence is there that the Scottish Government's doing better?
As I said, just from my caseload and people that I have been able to direct towards Scottish Government schemes, which are, we're not talking about things in the future and things which can be done, we're talking about things which are happening at the moment to offer people that support to have a look at their houses. And it can be, as you were talking about your own house there, my house is the same. It's older. It's certainly not been built considering keeping heat in and so on. So it is quite a complicated picture, and we've obviously got a wide variety of housing across Scotland, some of it which is going to be particularly problematic. But they're tenement buildings, for example. There have been some really interesting looking pilot schemes which have been funded to look at how we can properly insulate these buildings and be able to reduce people's bills and protect the environment at the same time.
Well, I mean, looking at the cost of living, it's the Bank of England said to expect high interest rates for at least 2 years as it raised interest rates for the 14th time to 5.25%. Inflation has come down, but that just means prices are not rising as much, but they are still rising and affecting the most basic living costs for those on the lowest incomes, who campaigners say are also being affected by the UK social security regime. I was seeing somewhere today that the average rent in London looks like raising to 2,700 a month, and I mean that's bonkers. But I'm looking. I mean, I told the other day a one-bedroom flat in the middle of Dundee up in Stolbswell is now going for £500 a month. I mean, that's just, how are people supposed to afford this? I mean, Hugh, what are your views on the way in the way in which our household incomes are being suppressed? So the UK government is putting in pretty sort of Dickensian anti-strike legislation, um, and doctors, nurses, firefighters, far less shop workers and others on low wages are still expected to survive the coming winter. What's the thoughts from Wales?
Yeah, well, I think it's the same in Wales as it is in Scotland. But interesting with Katy on today. I think it was Annalise Dodds was on Radio 4 early in the week, and she was talking about the upcoming by-election, and talking about how the Conservatives are doing nothing for cost of living crisis for people in Scotland. And also she was having a pop at the SNP for failing to do that as well, whilst ignoring the fact that sort of we've got a Labour government in Wales, and they're doing nothing. And one of the reasons they're not doing as much as the SNP doing in Scotland is the fact that they don't have the levers to do that. So I think that's the frustrating thing, is people expect sort of the devolved governments to do more, but they're restricted because it's just based on they're administering on behalf of the Conservatives in Westminster, because they're handing out the cash. So until we've got the levers to be able to to affect change, it's a very challenging situation. But as you say, in Wales, 1 in 3 children live in poverty. It's 1 in 2 in some areas, and those are areas, in the post-industrial valleys in the south, where people have been voting Labour for years, and that and that's the sad thing is that those are the areas where UKIP, when they got elected into the Assembly, as it was then the Senate now, is this dissatisfaction. The people, are frustrated, and that's that's why the culture war stuff. The Conservatives, they're trying to portray people coming in small boats. They're getting your jobs. They're getting your house. They're getting your place in school, whatever. And it's sad. We need to have grown up politics where we work collaboratively to try and improve the situation. And on the same subject, going back to the energy, in Wales, you've got a partnership agreement between the Welsh Labour government and Plaid Cymru, and they're in the process of setting up a state-owned energy company in order to try and address one of the key issues of the cost of living crisis, which is energy security and energy costs.
Well, it'd be interesting to see something along those lines in Scotland. I know that there have been a number of reasons. It was explained to me why the Scottish Government hadn't set such a thing up, but it would be interesting to see what will happen in the years to come when watching the Welsh example. But I mean, Hugh, just to stick with you for one more moment here, I mean, the Scottish Government has spent millions mitigating the two-child cap. So that means that the policy which the Labour Party has said that they will continue, but interestingly, the Labour candidate in Hamilton and Rutherglen West has said that he won't continue, but he doesn't have any say in that, seeing as he's under Keir Starmer's cosh. But I mean, the Scottish Government has spent millions mitigating the two-child cap, and that basically means that in England, if you have 2 children and you're in receipt of, if you have more than 2 children and you're in receipt of benefits, then you don't get any more money for those children. And if you have a 3rd child and you want to claim money for that 3rd child, or you've got multiple children, but you want to try and claim one more child, support for one more child, you have to prove that child is a product of rape, and that's the so-called rape clause, which is just an abomination in the eyes of most decent people, I would suggest. But what's the situation in Wales, Hugh? I mean, is Wales able to mitigate the 2-child cap?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know, but I don't think that it has, because I haven't heard that it has been mitigated. But again, I think Scotland has more powers in different areas, so they have more controls in different areas. Because basically in Wales, from a devolved position, it's mainly education, health, and transport. Those are the three areas that we have controls over. So when you're going into things like benefits and social security, we don't have the same powers that Scotland probably has, and that's a frustration. So what happens in Wales is it's sort of Welsh Labour is, oh, we can't do this, pointing the finger at Westminster. And then they're always claiming, if you vote for Labour, we get a Labour government and everything's going to be fine. But I think what's going to be interesting now is this juxtaposition between what Welsh Labour are doing, who are quite progressive, and work collaboratively with Plaid Cymru, compared with UK Labour and Scottish Labour, who are just basically SNP bad. And it's interesting, and I think there's a dimension there that needs discussing in Scotland. Because I know the Conservatives point at Wales that the health situation here, the NHS in Wales, is in the worst situation of all of them. But there's no context about, we've got high levels of poverty, we've got a much older population, but still we only get the funding based on the ridiculous Barnett formula.
So yeah, I mean, Katy, it's an interesting point, isn't it, that you've got the Electoral Commission this week clarifying that Scottish Labour is actually just UK Labour with a pretty little thistle put on top of it, and the candidate is kind of managing to kind of like be Schrodinger's Labour, in that he's both listening to Keir Starmer, but he has strength to ignore him and somehow speak out, and a vote for him isn't a vote for London Labour, and yet it is. So I mean, do you get the feeling that voters are savvy to what nonsense that is?
Yes, absolutely. I love the phrase Schrodinger's Labour, I've got to say. This is playing out in real time in Rutherglen and Hamilton West just now, as you said. We've got not only the Labour candidate, but we've got the local CLP who are absolutely tying themselves up in knots like a pretzel at the moment, trying to assert that they are Scottish Labour as if that is some separate entity, and we know what the Electoral Commission has just said on that. We've had Sir Keir up here a couple of times, standing in the local shopping centre, half a mile down the road from me. We've had the photo ops with gourmet deep fried Mars bars, and I wish I was joking on that, but I wasn't. And then fast forward a couple of weeks, and we've had all of the U-turns, which we've spoken about, on the 2-child cap, on the bedroom cap, all of these bedroom tax, all of these abhorrent policies, these Tory policies, which are causing so much misery in this area, that Labour are not going to oppose. I think it's been really interesting that Sarwar has been nowhere to be seen over the past week. He wasn't at the launch of their campaign last week. And we've got a candidate scooting around the constituency claiming that he's going to stand up to Starmer, and he'll vote against this and he'll vote against that. Well, my first point is he's not going to get the chance to vote against any of this, because when he is down there, he's going to be following the UK Labour, the Starmer whip, and he will do as he is told, and he's not going to have that opportunity to vote, because Starmer will not, his government, if he was to be in power, would not be bringing forward any proposals to scrap these abhorrent policies. I mean, it's unmitigated nonsense, to be frank, and the candidate's position fell apart on the slightest bit of pressure on camera on Newsnight the other night, when he was asked, well, will you stand up to Starmer? Have you had this conversation? Starmer's been up here 2 or 3 times to memory, and he hasn't actually spoken to him about it.
But I mean, in terms of the hit that businesses and individuals are taking, a lot of folk, those who are able to buy their own houses, have bought them finding that they're being squeezed, the Brexit effect on food and drink, the cost of living, the Ukraine war effect, the COVID effect, all of these things, it's kind of like creating a perfect economic storm. I mean, if you're Jacob Rees-Mogg and you know you want to follow up in your daddy's book, how to get rich from crisis, I paraphrase. I mean, this is just the kind of time for those kind of disaster capitalists to just start mopping up. I mean, in terms of the the genuine despair or genuine concern, perhaps not as far as despair for many people, but despair for some, certainly, in terms of people worrying about their houses, worrying about feeding themselves, worrying about the next rises to come. I mean, the whole thing about the EU, the EU checks that the UK was meant to be implementing as part of their great Brexit freedoms. They were supposed to be implementing checks on produce coming into the borders this October, but they've scrapped that again because of the inflationary effect that would have on food and drink in particular, and food security. I mean, food security is a massive issue as we watch Europe burn, as the rain falls continually on Scottish crops. I was speaking to a farmer the other day who said that the grain they put in for human consumption now isn't even fit for sheep. It's going to have to go for cattle. So, I mean, there's massive food security issues. I mean, Hugh, what do you think are the main concerns that people are looking at as they're facing a winter with the potential of yet more interest rate rises?
Yeah, I think it is a crisis, and there doesn't seem to be any answer to it. We've seen from Starmer and Jeremy Hunt, his five priorities. Halving inflation by the end of the year. That looks highly unlikely. And as you say, inflation, okay, it's slowing down, but food inflation, I think, it's at its lowest level. It's still going up around sort of 13% a month. And like I say, I've just checked now, and in Wales, the 2-child cap, there is no mitigation. And ironically, it was like 2 weeks ago, the Children's Commissioner for Wales raised concerns about the impact of child poverty in Wales. And saying, that continuously calling on the Welsh Government to plan and monitor specific and measurable actions to help these numbers of children. But it's clear that the UK government are responsible for the main levers. So I think, there is that frustration. And what's sad is, the political parties tend to use these as, sticks to beat each other with, from an election point of view. And what's really depressing is, we've heard from Starmer that basically, if he gets into power, he's going to carry on doing what the Conservatives are doing now. And I think that's what's really, worrying people is they're just seeing, well, there is, where is the hope? Where is the change? Where is, the brave thinking that's going to help people on a day-to-day basis. But I think it's almost like with 13 years of the Conservatives and austerity that everybody seems to be conditioned to just thinking, well, this is our lot. Everything's awful. It's going to be awful for a bit longer, and hopefully, it'll get better at some point. But it's genuinely, it's really depressing, and I'm worried for people. Mental health, physical health. This winter is gonna impact a lot of people, and we don't know about. I've heard lots of reports of COVID being around now. What's going to happen in the winter with that, and the pressures on the NHS. The knock-on effects of all of these things. They're just horrific. But you've got a government basically in their death throes in Westminster, who are basically trying to hold on to their base by, throwing dead cats out there, saying small boats, and that's responsible for everything. And the fact that they're actually using that and manufacturing a crisis by not sorting out the backlog, by trying to make out that, we haven't got anywhere to put all these people, we've got to put them in hotels and stuff like that, and turning them into the enemy is despicable. But, that's where we're at, unfortunately.
So, I mean, Mark Drakeford. I have family down in Wales, and they refer with some affection to good old Drakey because I mean, quite youngsters are going, "Oh, Drakey, he's the man." Pardon the accent. But I mean, I think that Mark Drakeford seems to have some degree of respect from a lot of youngsters because they they do see that he's kind of that he's an egalitarian, that he's trying to do things differently, and it's interesting
Yeah.
because as a I mean he often says, you know, that he is a unionist, but that the union is leaving Wales rather than Wales leaving the union. So, I mean, with Labour in Westminster saying that they would never do a deal with the SNP, but Labour in Wales quite happily or pragmatically doing a deal with Plaid Cymru. Um, can you see there being a point at which Welsh Labour actually becomes the Labour of Wales and splits? I mean, we touched on this earlier. You know, this whole kind of the manufacturing of Welsh Labour, the Welsh Conservatives, Scottish Labour, the Scottish Conservatives. I mean, it's just a kind of like a little veneer that's slipped over to try and hide the fact that everybody's still controlled from, you know, London. So, I mean, what's the view on Wales in that?
Yeah, oh no, because like you said, you know, the Welsh Labour MPs and the Welsh Labour Senedd members, they're like complete, you know, they're like two different breeds of cat. Or you could go as far as saying, you know, one, you know, one of the one group of cat and the other one's are dogs. You've got people like you know, Stephen Kinnock, who, you know, who's the shadow, I think, immigration minister, you know, talking today about keeping on the barges, you know, you know, if they're elected. Again, you know, trying to blame the Conservatives, and you got people like Chris Bryant in the Rondo, who's talking about, you know, who's written a book about, you know, the meritocracy and all that sort of stuff, and accepting an honour, you know, and they are, you know, they're completely different. But that's what's interesting is when it comes to the general election, they'll fight using Mark Drakeford because Drakeford is a positive. And remember, Drakeford was a supporter of Corbyn. You know, he is of that, you know, that wing of the Labour Party. But no, definitely, you know, there's a group within Labour in Wales, Labour for Independent Wales. So, you know, they want to see a Labour Party within an independent Wales, you know, being that party. But no, you know, there's more and more pressure coming on them in Wales, especially, you know, the last polling suggested that over 50% of Labour voters support independence. You know, that doesn't mean they'd vote for it tomorrow, but they support the concept and the idea of it. So, you know, there is that different direction of travel. And I think in Scotland, obviously, you know, the unionist vote, you know, so Labour are going after that, you know, conservative unionist vote. Whereas in Wales, it's a different area. And I think one of the problems Plaid Cymru has faced is that Labour, you know, politically, from a policy point of view, are quite similar in a lot of areas. So, you know, sort of Labour have almost parked their, you know, tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawn, saying, you know, we are Welsh, you know, we're proud of our Welshness. You know, but again, you know, they are, at the end of the day, they are a unionist party. But I can definitely see them, you know, splitting up, because I don't think relations are very good between Starmer and Drakeford, because every time Drakeford says something from a Welsh Labour perspective, a lot of the time it contradicts what Starmer is saying, and I can imagine the type of person Starmer is, that doesn't go down very well.
It's interesting because I mean, it's I quite often end up looking at the Labour Party, and I kind of wonder what the point of them is these days. It's and again, it's one of those things. I mean, I was quite hopeful when Starmer took over, I guess, with a sort of, you know, that 1997 starry eyes of when Tony Blair took over and actually managed to wrest the country out of the Tory grip. So I kind of thought, oh, maybe Starmer, you know, I mean, I like Corbyn, but, you know, maybe Starmer will do this, and then suddenly he sort of turns into this nodding dog that's just, I mean, it's really interesting because it's in a depressing kind of way, because it's like the politics in the London-based companies, parties, has kind of just shifted a step to the right. So the Tories are now where UKIP once was, the Tea Party once was, or, you know, and Labour now is kind of where the sort of left of centre part of the Tory party was. And the Lib Dems, I mean, you know, God, who knows what they're all about. But I mean, it used to be that the old days, you know, Labour or Tory, if they were going to migrate from one party to the other, they would sort of take the route via the Lib Dems, and they just don't anymore. So, I mean, in terms of in terms of what a meaningful alternative is, I guess for a lot of people in England, it can only be the Green Party, is what I'm hearing from some people, if they have left of centre policies. But that's more as a kind of protest vote because they can't see that's going to get anywhere. But Katy, I mean, you're out there knocking on doors. I mean, what is the perspective that you are getting? Because it very much feels to me as though the SNP, Hugh talks about sort of Labour in Wales parking the tanks on the lawns of Plaid Cymru. Well, it kind of seems like while Labour was flirting with the right, the SNP kind of just sort of stepped in and adopted those policies of a left of centre, um, not socialist, but socially aware, socially careful. A party that was about justice and mitigating or making life better for people rather than making life better for themselves. So, I mean, how does that go down in Glasgow, or how does it go? Sorry, pardon me, in Rutherglen and Hamilton? I mean, do people get that, or is it just the case that actually it doesn't really matter if you're a unionist, you're going to vote for the Lib Dems or for Labour or for the Tories if the Lib Dems even bother standing? You know what I mean? Or I mean, what are the
Yes,
politics like now? Are you finding that?
yes, I do. I think it's been very interesting to hear Hugh's perspective on this as well, because it just shows the many faces of the Labour Party across the UK. In the Scottish context, Hugh had made a really good point earlier as well about when we have people coming up here from UK-based parties to fight in this by-election. It's really interesting to look at their record elsewhere in other devolved areas as well, and to be challenged on that record. What people in South Lanarkshire can see at the moment is what happens when Labour actually do get into power. And what we have seen here is the effect of that, and that unionism trumps all when it comes to voting. So in South Lanarkshire at the moment, Labour are in a minority administration. I am a South Lanarkshire SNP councillor. The SNP won the highest number of seats here. Currently in the ward I'm sitting in Rutherglen, we had elected 2 SNP councillors out of 3 councillors. However, Labour are propped up by a couple of Lib Dems, and they rely on Tory votes to get their policies through, to get their budgets through. And the Tory leader, one particular council budget, actually had been sort of humming and hawing, making his contribution to a debate, and then said that he was going to vote in a unionist fashion. So it's very clear. And what this has actually meant for voters of South Lanarkshire, and what people are telling us on the doorstep, is it has been a shambles since they have taken over. Because at the end of the day, as I said, unionism trumps all. Sticking together, this sort of ramshackle collection of councillors they've got, is more important than serving the people. We've had the Labour leader is currently suspended. His deputy, who stepped into his shoes, has been censured twice by the Standards Commission. We've had a big council tax raise. We've got a pause on urgent housing repairs for tenants. I've got one constituent who's been in touch this week who has nails sticking out of her floor, and she's been told, keep her baby away from them. It's not acceptable. And they've raised prices for grassroots sports clubs and activities for our children and young people by 114%. They're further heaping misery on families. And the more we go out and talk to people, that is what is being reflected back to us on the doorstep. That's what they can see that Labour in control of South Lanarkshire means.
I mean, it's often said that general elections are won on national issues and by-elections are won on local issues. I mean, how have you had an opportunity yet to speak to the Labour candidate and to see, sort of, have you had a chance to sort of, be on debates with them, or how does it kind of, what kind of responses are you getting from people when they see the pair of you side by side?
I've met him once. I've had the opportunity to meet him once and shook his hand at a charity event that we both happened to be attending the other day. I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to have those wider debates. I certainly, as I say, I've been a councillor here since 2017. So in terms of getting involved, having these wider conversations with the local Labour Party, that's certainly something that I have been doing for many years, and I've been standing up for my constituents in Cambuslang East for those number of years. It's interesting what you were saying about by-elections being one on local and national issues. I think we're seeing a real mix of the two at the moment. 100% the most pertinent issue on the doorstep for everyone is the cost of living crisis. But that is related complex issues around that, and I suppose you can say there's sort of three prongs. People are extremely worried about housing and the mortgage costs and interest rate rises. I've had long conversations on the doorstep. One the other day about my children are getting older now. We were speaking about our children's generation, when they will be able to move out, what their prospects are going to be, how they've been stymied by Brexit and so on. Rising living costs as well, so the sort of second prong, everyday goods and services. Speaking to a small business owner earlier in the week who's been in Rutherglen for 20 years and has seen a huge change in spending habits, what people are able to spend on new goods, what they're prepared to spend, and how he's having to support his staff as well in the efforts that he's making, because he and his staff are obviously feeling the pinch as well. And yesterday in a cafe, speaking to a business owner about how people are buying fewer treats, fewer ice creams and sweeties for their children during the summer holidays, which is really sad to see. And it's just this relentlessness of the squeeze which people are feeling. And then thirdly, and I know we've covered it in some detail already, but just the cruelty of the UK social security regime. And I'm proud of the record that the SNP has in government, lifting 90,000 children out of poverty with measures like the Scottish Child Payment, and what my group have been able to do when we were in administration in council as well, in terms of introducing free breakfast clubs, free lunchtime activity clubs during holidays and so on, to try to give people some relief. But at the end of the day, we are doing all of that with one hand tied behind our back.
I mean, before we move on to the next story, just one final question for you on this subject, Katy, is, I mean, how live is the issue of Scottish independence for the people that you're speaking to on the door?
Extremely live. I mean, it's I'm proud to be standing as an SNP candidate with, I've got independence running through me like a stick of rock, as does my party. And it's all interrelated, and people really understand that when you're speaking to them, and that's what people want to talk to us about. The only way that we are going to be able to completely get away from these cruel Tory policies, from the economic crisis, is if we have the full levers of power at our disposal. So everything comes back to independence. And the reason that has been so uncomfortable so far, as I was saying earlier, I've only seen the Tory candidate speak once very briefly from Glasgow, not from the constituency. And his only message so far seems to be, they're always banging on about independence. Yes, we are. I'm proud of that, because independence is the only way that we're going to get out of the mess which has been created by the Tories and the cruel policies of the Westminster government.
And which seem to be on the manifesto for being continued by Labour, whether they call themselves Scottish Labour or not. So moving on to our next story, Donald Trump. Gosh, Donald Trump. He's appeared in court this week on his third criminal indictment. Who's a fan of Jack Smith? Me. Hello. I am very interested in what's happening here. But I mean, in terms of the future of democracy, it's absolutely fascinating and yet wholly depressing the way in which the former president seems to think that if he can only kind of, get on and get back in, maybe he'll avoid the orange jumpsuit. But I mean, when you look at what happened last week, for example, he was indicted yet again. Mike Pence has come out speaking very clearly and pretty damningly about him. Donald Trump immediately starts tweeting in a hostile way about him, having been told not to tweet or to threaten anybody. I think one of the first things he did when he came out of court was to say in capital letters, "If you come after me, I'll come after you," on his Truth Social. And he's now in court again tomorrow to, I think, come up with a reason as to why he shouldn't be in trouble for threatening witnesses, all of whom so far seem to be from the Republican Party. So, I mean, is this an indication? It's nuanced. I mean, depending on where you read, if you read, for example, commentators on Twitter, it seems to be everybody saying, well, Trump's base is such that they love him whatever, and they're all going to think it's a conspiracy. And the worse he does, the more that they hound him and come after him, the more that they're going to love him. So the Republicans are going to want to vote for Trump, and he can, according to the American system, still be elected president even if he's in jail. However, if you look on on Threads or some of these, looking at other commentators, they're saying, well, actually, yeah, okay, you might have the Proud Boys and the kind of, sort of the far right aspects of the Republicans, but who love Trump still. But it's the moderate voters, it's the moderate Republicans who won't turn out for him. And actually, the policies that are happening are so bad that it's more likely to increase the Democratic vote coming out. So, Hugh, what is your take on the endless attention seeking of Trump? Has he finally met his match in the prosecutor that is coming after him with a precision which is quite interesting to watch?
One would hope so, but having said that, he is innocent until he's found guilty, and that's what's interesting. I think it was Ipsos did some polling earlier in the week with Republican voters, and what was very illuminating there was the fact that if he is convicted of a felony, then those Republicans who support him, that support collapses quite substantially. I think it's something like 55% of those who would support him now wouldn't vote for him if he was convicted. So, it's a 55 to, still 45% of them would vote for him if he was in prison. But you can see that, that is a big drop. So I think, there is that element of persecution. But if it is proven in a court of law, and the evidence comes out, because it looks like, they've obviously got people who have, turned against him, who are giving evidence. A lot of people talking about Mark Meadows and, what he was the one who was orchestrating it all, and nobody's heard from him. But also there was another interesting statistic that since 2016, when he won the last election, 32 million younger people have become eligible to vote, and 20 million voters have died through old age. So, that's another 50 million swing. So again, whether they register, there's a lot of stuff going on there. Same here, with suppressing, voter suppression with registration. But it all depends on whether he is convicted and the timeframes of when it's done. But, it is just depressing, when, when you get people sort of criticizing Biden, saying, oh, he's too old, and, he's, he when he talks, it doesn't make sense. Trump is, 77. He's not that, there's not much difference. And I don't know if you've listened to Trump. Have you ever heard him make any sense whatsoever?
I think the phrase that I first saw coined about Trump's oratorial skills, which I thought was quite apt, was word salad, which I thought was quite an interesting way of describing it. But I mean, it obviously you're right. It has to be proven in a court of law. I think the nuance seems to be whether or not. I mean, there's no doubt that he was sort of calling for people to come out, and there's no doubt that he was challenging the result. I guess it's whether or not he was doing so in a felonious way, I think is the way that it's put. I mean, depressingly, it kind of, it's sort of, the saying, if you well, I'll not go too far down the same, but, if you sort of pass wind in the UK, then something more dramatic has happened when it reaches America. But I mean, in terms of sort of Trump and the Republicans and their shift to the far right, and the Tories and Johnson and Sunak and their shift to the right, I mean, there do seem to be parallels. I mean, the whole, Carol Cadwallader and her investigative work looking at the sort of the Tufton Street influences of the likes of Cambridge Analytica. I mean, do you think that what we learn from Trump and what we learn from the Tories and Boris Johnson is that actually we need to be a lot more careful about the way in which our news reaches us, Katy?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I think you were bang on at the beginning, talking about it being a grimly fascinating, if wholly depressing situation. And I do think there are parallels here, because I think it's all to do with the increasing polarisation which we're seeing in global politics. So we've got the Democrats and the left painting any potential return of Trump as an existential threat. And personally, that resonates with me. I can understand that. If you look at the overturning of Roe versus Wade, if my daughter or I were in the US in a state who had jumped on that, I would see that as a threat which could risk our lives. I think the interesting part is how some Republicans and the right are doing the same. So they're painting a vote for Biden as an existential threat, saying that anything that has the faintest whiff of socialism is big state, it's anti-American, it's a threat to essential freedoms. And there is this idea of people being thrown, the more action that is taken against Trump, the more action that was taken against Johnson, the harder people might vote for them, or they might vote for the Tories, or they might vote for the Republicans. So, in some ways, although it might seem astounding to some of us, it's maybe not that extraordinary that people would still would respond to that sort of messaging when this extreme polarization has been allowed to flourish in certain sections of the media and certain sections of social media. People will perhaps be prepared to do what sounds unbelievable and potentially vote for a presidential candidate when he's behind bars.
I mean, it's just, as a journalist, I obviously am passionate about accurate freedom of speech and accurate representation. And I'm looking at the Ofcom Media Nations report. They say that 93% of homes in Scotland have an internet connection, even if it can be a bit duff sometimes, and 69% have a connected TV. And people in Scotland watch more broadcast TV than the rest of the UK, which that's the TV that's coming through your aerial or through your cable, your Freeview. BBC Scotland is trusted by 43% of Scots for news and current affairs, ahead of STV at 40%. So, I mean, Broadcasting Scotland is sort of paving the way. Is it time for an independent Scottish broadcaster? Hugh, you've got S4C down in Wales, which I look quite enviously at sometimes. I mean, I cut my teeth in journalism. I was so privileged and lucky to have been able to learn as a cub reporter up in BBC Orkney and BBC Shetland, and then went to work for BBC Scotland. And I was so proud to do that, because the ethical standards, the reporting standards that I was trained to, I think were absolutely exemplary. And then I went away, came back 10 years later, and was actually really shocked. I mean, really shocked at what I saw with my previous employers. And things like a certain percentage of programs have to be made in Scotland. But I know for a fact that what happens is a lot of the time it's producers are brought up from London to come and make the programs in Scotland using London production companies, and away off they go back, trotting off once the job's done. And we don't even get to see our Parliament on TV anymore, because that was cut. If it wasn't for people like Broadcasting Scotland, we wouldn't get to see that on our tellies. So I mean, Hugh, S4C, what exactly is it for those people who aren't aware of what an amazing channel is, and what can we do to try and get something similar in Scotland?
Yeah, so S4C was set up in 1982. Started broadcasting as a response, obviously, for the Welsh language. It's vital for any language, from a cultural perspective, that it's represented in in a modern form. So that's where S4C came from. So Welsh language channel broadcasts throughout the day through the media Welsh. News, current affairs, entertainment, factual, basically everything a TV channel does. What's interesting from a news perspective, their news is supplied by the BBC as part of a deal, that was set up originally, and it's funding now. Originally, the funding came from the Westminster, from the DCMS, but all of its funding now all comes from the licence fee. So that's how it operates, and I think a lot of people feel there should be an English language version of it in Wales, and as should be everywhere. But I think that's one of the issues within the United Kingdom, is that the BBC is basically, it is the British Broadcasting Corporation. But what's interesting from a news perspective, when you look at S4C news, the BBC produces, it starts with Wales, and then it starts about the UK, and then international. It's almost like a flip around of what the BBC do in English, and generally, hands up. I used to work for S4C. I was the head of digital for 4 years, and it does have a popular response. But as you mentioned, Ofcom's report, people are watching fewer hours of television, younger audiences, and that's the big challenge. Is they're just not what younger people, they're watching television, but they're not watching stuff that's coming from public service broadcasters. But what's interesting, Scotland has got BBC Scotland and BBC Alba, so you've got those two separate entities. So S4C is like Alba, but obviously producing far more hours with a much bigger budget. But we don't have in English then what you have in Scotland. We've got BBC Wales with opt-outs, but it just tends to be sort of magazine programs and the odd current affairs program.
So I mean, Katy, it's there are many who are working to see the Scots language, for example, brought back into primacy. The reason we aren't speaking in Scots today is because most folk couldn't, because we had it beaten out of us when we were at school. So in order for folk to be able to speak, I mean, working in Shetland was amazing because folk spoke broad Shetlandic there, and I learned a lot about mother tongues, sort of broadcasting there. And at what point do you think the Scottish government will try and bring in, or at what point do you think you, if you were elected as an MP, would be able to make steps to have the Scots lead and Scots perspectives brought onto Scottish programming? If Broadcasting Scotland in a perfect world had the budget, then we'd be able to make programs in Scots 24 hours a day.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And it's about the perspective being brought to screens. I've been thinking this morning about the World Cycling Championships, right? So I'm sitting in Rutherglen just now. It's happening a stone's throw away. Once in a lifetime event. First time all of the championships have happened in one place. So men's, women's, youth, para events, biggest cycling event ever. Really, really hard to watch. There's wee bits and pieces on BBC iPlayer. Apparently Eurosport is quite good if you want sort of rider by rider, heat times and all of that. But if you look at actually what is happening in my little part of Scotland just now, so locally I was down visiting Healthy and Happy, who are a local charity. They're on a scheme called Bike Town, looking to get affordable cycles into people's hands, to build up people's confidence, to get them to take on forms of active travel. This is all related back to things which we were talking about earlier. It's so important. There's a new cycle track in Cambuslang, which has had a huge amount of funding. There's so many community groups have been involved down there. Schools have been involved. It's going to be a national centre of excellence when it is completed. It's fabulous. For about a year, I've been involved with the work about opening up a new bridge in my ward to connect communities, again, to promote active travel, so we have better cycling routes and so on. So sorry, that was a long explanation, but my point is there's a huge story going on locally here. There's a huge amount of cultural change which is happening in this area, so much interest, so much opportunity to promote what is happening here, travel, leisure, our country, to tell a really good story. And how it's been covered in the mainstream news at the moment is essentially being politicised. It's been about Glasgow City Council, and this is terrible, and someone's spotted a pothole here. We're just not getting the opportunity for those Scottish stories to cut through just now without organisations like yourself bringing them to the fore, and giving people like you and I an opportunity to come on it and speak about them. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm very glad that you did come on. It takes me beautifully to our final farewell. That's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, even with this cost of living crisis, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. As we were talking just now, we can make these programmes 24 hours a day. The studios in Glasgow are amazing, and there's lots of potential for getting folk out and about and doing broadcasts from all over Scotland, but we do need the funds. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and ensure that we're able to continue making programmes. We have raised over £10,500 so far, and thank you to everybody who supported us, but we urgently need to raise the remaining £19,500 as soon as possible. So if you could just check ahead your couch, that would be Barry. Thank you again to our guests, Katy Loudon, Councillor and SNP candidate, and Hugh Marshall of Talking Wales. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.
Bye.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.